Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 322. I'm the co-host Kyle Anzalone. Today joined by co-host Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing?
Doing great, Kyle. How are you?
Doing very well. We got a lot to cover on today's show, Connor. So let's just remind people where they can find the show, how they can support the show, then get right into the news. The best place to find the show is, of course, at the Libertarian Institute. You can also find the show on the blog at antiwar.com. You can subscribe to the show for the video version, YouTube, Rumble, and Odyssey. The podcast should be up anywhere you could listen to podcasts. If you want it up somewhere else, please get in touch with myself or Connor, and we could work on that. If you would like to donate to the show, we have Patreon, Subscribestar, we take crypto, all that information, the show notes page. And the best way to help out the show and to help yourself out is to do your CBD shopping with our sponsor, Paloma Verde, PalomaVerdeCBD.com, promo code PEACE, PEACE. That saves you 20% when you spend $75 or more, and it gets the show a kickback. So that's a pretty awesome deal, Connor, because it's a great way. You're gonna get something for yourself, but you're also supporting the show with every purchase you make from Paloma Verde. So if somebody is new to CBD, Connor, what would you recommend?
Check out the soft gels. I think, I'm trying to remember what the dosage is exactly. I think it's 25 or 30 milligrams. And they're perfect. You just take them after a meal, and they'll hit you in like a half hour. Any kind of inflammation, any kind of pain, any kind of stress, anxiety, whatever you're dealing with, it's going to take care of it. If you've got insomnia or just having trouble sleeping lately, you take some CBD toward the end of the night after dinner, you're going to have a real easy time getting to sleep, and it's going to be some good sleep as well. I recommend also the gummy bears. They're delicious. Those will hit you instantly. They're a little bit lighter in the dosage, so you can take them on the go. Also they have some great ones for your dogs you can get to help them out if they're getting a little older. You got a little joint pain or whatever's going on, just trying to calm them down. If you live in a noisy area, that's perfect. And my favorite right now is the full spectrum oil, which now the tinctures are, I think, the best bang for your buck, the strongest stuff. And it lasts a really long time, and they taste very good. You can add them to food, drinks, whatever, or just take it directly. And that full spectrum oil has been fantastic for me. Great after workouts, or like I said, if you're trying to get some better sleep, it's just absolutely fantastic. So check out all of that stuff.
PalomaVerdeCBD.com, promo code PEACE. Connor, let's get into the news today. The first article we co-authored at the Libertarian Institute, titled "The White House Will Press Israel to Review Policy in Response to American Journalist Murder." And so this is the latest article that I've written here about Shireen Abu Akleh, who was in May murdered by the Israeli Defense Forces while wearing a bulletproof vest and helmet. So we write here, the Joe Biden administration said it would continue to press Tel Aviv to review its policies after the Israeli government issued a report saying its forces likely murdered Al Jazeera journalist Shireen Abu Akleh. She was reporting on a raid in the West Bank when she was shot in the head while wearing a bulletproof vest. Abu Akleh was killed at the Jenin refugee camp in May. Initially, after her death, Tel Aviv claimed she was likely killed by Palestinians. However, that narrative was quickly debunked by Israeli human rights groups. One Israeli official said the Palestinian-American journalist was killed because she was armed with a camera. Video of the murder showed Shireen and several of her colleagues all wearing bulletproof gear labeled press when Israeli soldiers opened fire. Another journalist was wounded, and the soldiers continued to fire as he and others attempted to give aid to Abu Akleh. Several Western media outlets carried out independent investigations and found that Israeli soldiers killed Abu Akleh. The White House called for accountability without directly condemning Tel Aviv. Last week, Israel issued a report saying one of its soldiers likely shot Abu Akleh in the face inadvertently. There is a high possibility that Abu Akleh was accidentally killed by IDF Israeli army gunfire, the investigation found. However, no Israeli soldiers have been held accountable for the murder. As the report concluded, there is no suspicion a criminal offense occurred. And just to get into and break this down a little bit in more detail than is in this than we have in this article, Connor. The finding of that report said that Abu Akleh was killed because there was fighting in the area and the Israeli soldiers mistook Abu Akleh for that. But CNN video that was released at the time shows that there was no fire occurring at the time, and so the report is clearly covering up something still, and this is what was to be expected. Now, the reason this report held some importance is because the White House was waiting, I guess, to use this report, or was considering using this well, the White House said we had to wait on this report to, make decisions. And so now that we got this report, the White House is saying, no, this is a step towards accountability and whatever. But obviously it's not, because they're saying no further investigation is needed. Now, it is interesting because you had the statement given by the press secretary Ned Price for the State Department, just kind of a blanket statement saying this, bad that she was killed, and we hope for accountability, and not, saying anything remotely critical of Israel. And then we had the deputy spokesperson for the State Department, Patel, saying we will continue to press Israel directly and closely at the senior most levels to review its policies and practices to ensure this is something that doesn't happen again in the future. And so, Connor, I think, we're almost seeing somewhat different statements here. Is from lower level officials that we're getting this, report that, we're requesting Israel to review its policy. Now, of course, we've talked about this in the past on the show because I've written about this before. Last month, Axios report, the State Department had urged Tel Aviv to review its policies in the West Bank, and Israeli officials said no request was made at the time, going on to say that even if Washington had made such a request, Tel Aviv would reject it. The official said Israel is a sovereign country and the rules of engagement save lives. And if that sounds surprisingly cruel or something, just wait till the next article that I have. But getting back and some more bad story and details just on the Abu Akleh situation here. While it's uncommon for Washington to make any statement critical of Tel Aviv, the request for policy review is unlikely to place any real pressure on Israel. The White House has not officially condemned Israel for the murder of the American journalist. After Abu Akleh was killed, President Biden traveled to Israel, where he proudly declared himself a Zionist. And it's important to remember that it's not just that she was murdered, Connor. It's that, this is a very recognizable figure for Palestinians. I don't want to compare her to Megyn Kelly necessarily in the work that she does, but in the sense that, like, if you put Megyn Kelly on TV, almost every American is going to recognize her. But Shireen has a 25-year legacy. After her death, a lot of especially female Palestinian journalists talked about how important she particularly was to, them being able to become a journalist and all this. So, massive loss. But also, I think we see here with her murder just how much Israel could get away with, even when it comes to an offense of an American here. So, absolutely shocking. And then, of course, they harassed her funeral. They assaulted the pallbearers at the funeral. They ripped down Palestinian flags. Immediately after she was dead, they harassed people at her home who were, trying to mourn and celebrate her life and stuff like that. So, really disturbing things happening here. Biden said the U.S. relationship with the Jewish state is bone deep, and speaking for the vast majority of Americans, stated emphatically that we are completely devoted to Israel's security without any ifs, ands, or buts and doubts about it. In 2020, the Palestinian Journalist Syndicate in Tel Aviv said Tel Aviv had killed 46 Palestinian journalists since 2000. During the assault on Gaza last May, which killed more than 250 people, including almost 70 children, Israeli forces notoriously bombed towers housing international media. All right, so that's Article 1. And then Article 2 is the Israeli response, and this from the Libertarian Institute. Israel firmly rebukes a White House request to review policies after death of American journalist. Israel Prime Minister Yair Lapid issued a stern response to a request from the Joe Biden administration. After the murder of Palestinian journalist Shireen Abu Akleh on Tuesday, the State Department asked Tel Aviv to review its rules of engagement in the occupied West Bank. On Wednesday, Lapid fired back, saying no one will dictate our rules of engagement to us. And so I've already talked about the murder here, so I'm not going to cover the entire article. And I discuss here too how the Israeli narrative has evolved. But I go on to really talk about in this one how, look, Washington is Israel's most important benefactor, providing some $3.8 billion in military aid annually. And because Abu Akleh is a dual American citizen, the journalist family and rights groups have urged the White House to take action. While the Biden administration has said the death is tragic, it has not condemned Tel Aviv or pressed for accountability for Abu Akleh's killers. So look, if you give Israel $3.8 billion in aid, you could say to Tel Aviv, you're a very wealthy country. None of your civilians are going to starve without this $3.8 billion. And so guess what? You're not going to get it until somebody goes on trial for murdering an American journalist. That's not happening. So obviously the White House doesn't actually want accountability. The state, we had these statements from the lower ranking members of the State Department. Honestly, Connor, I was in a way kind of surprised at how Israel reacted to this, because this is a pretty minor slap on the wrist here, right? They're basically saying, look, we don't like this, but nobody has to be held accountable. Just say you're going to do things differently in the future, and we'll say that's good enough. Here's your $3.8 billion. But they said that, and Israel absolutely went nuts and said, no, we get to, to go on with the article, Prime Minister Lapid firmly rebuked Washington for making the request, saying no one will dictate our rules of engagement to us when we are the ones fighting for our lives. Israel Defense Minister Benny Gantz added, the Israeli Defense Forces Chief of General Staff, and he alone determines what will continue to determine the rules of engagement in accordance with our operational needs and values of the IDF. Tel Aviv security forces have killed scores of Palestinian journalists since 2000, helping to suppress Palestinian voices as Israel seeks to maintain international support despite being labeled an apartheid state by several rights groups. And so, Connor, I'm not sure that this was a targeted killing. It would be a pretty bold claim to make to say that Israel ordered the killing of one of Palestine's most senior journalists, but it's quite clear that the situation that they put forward creates the likelihood that Israeli forces will kill Palestinian journalists on a somewhat regular basis, and far more are injured and beaten. But anyways, it creates just a general suppression of journalist ability, and then it takes Palestinian voices out of the media, and it's one of the key things that allows Israel to maintain its apartheid control over historic Palestine. It's extremely disturbing that America is so involved with it, but it is. And even the murder of an American journalist, a prominent American journalist working for a recognized, fairly establishment outlet. I'm not saying that Al Jazeera is, has the most best reputation in the West, but people recognize Al Jazeera, and it's not that offensive to most people. So kind of surprised maybe that this has gotten swept under the rug so effectively. but that just is the way the U.S.-Israel relationship works. And so, speaking of the U.S.-Israel relationship, I think you got some Iran news to talk about, but starting off here with the article from Day to Camp about the U.S. signing a deal to give Israel 4 refueling planes needed to bomb Iran. And I really wanted to ask you about this in particular because, more than anyone, I feel like you have talked about, hey, Israel really does need these planes to carry out the missions they claim they want to.
Right. Yeah. They. I mean, we covered last year extensively some of this stuff in the New York Times, where as much as the Israelis were talking about how they were ready to attack Iran and making all these big threats, there was later on a piece in the Times that was pretty where they walked a lot of that back, saying actually we don't really have the planes we need to do that kind of a mission because you have to travel. Something like 1,200 miles. They don't have, you'd have to stop and refuel you'd have to stop and refuel in one of the Gulf states. And while that's possible, it's not necessarily guaranteed. They lack the bunker buster bombs that are needed to hit the nuclear sites that have, as a result of previous Israeli covert attacks, been developed deeper underground. And so, of course, it always leads to them demanding additional aid from the Americans in order to pull off such a mission. So what we have here is, now the Pentagon has signed a contract with Boeing to provide Israel these 4 KC-46 refueling planes, which would be necessary for a war with Iran. And though the planes aren't going to be delivered until at least 2025. So Dave says here, the deal is worth $927 million, and Israel is purchasing the planes from Boeing with money from the $3.8 billion in military aid it receives from the U.S. each year. Of that amount, Israel receives $3.3 billion in foreign military financing, a State Department program that gives foreign governments money to purchase American-made military equipment. Israel has the option to order 4 more of these KC-46s in the future. The deal has been in the works for a long time, and Israel has previously asked if the U.S. Could accelerate the delivery of the planes. And that happened last year as well. But the U.S. denied the request because Washington would have to give up its spot in line in order to receive its KC-46s in order for Israel to get the planes faster. Now, Israel currently relies on these aging tankers for mid-air refueling, which aren't expected to be capable of supporting attacks on Iran. And according to the Times of Israel, the Israeli jets would need to travel, as I said, about 1,200 miles to strike targets in Iran, which would require these planes or someplace where they can refuel nearby. Now, I said that it's not guaranteed that they would be able to do that. I think that that states in the region do not want to open themselves up to retaliatory strikes from Iran and their ballistic missiles if they, facilitate an attack on their country. If these Gulf states facilitate an Israeli-American attack on Iran. And so, but what is alarming here is we're going to get to this in a moment, on Monday, Biden flew some B-52s over the Middle East, and it sounds like they were joined at different points by Saudi and Kuwaiti aircraft. So we'll get into that in a moment. So here's the next article I have. Nuclear deal seems unlikely as U.S. slams Iran's response is moving backwards. And this is, again, from Dave DeCamp on September 1st. And the real it did seem like we were closer to reaching a deal here than we have been throughout this whole process since Biden came into office. And even U.S. officials, as we covered here in recent weeks, were saying, hey, they're making so many concessions now, Iran is, that we're closer than ever, and it's because of that. But now, the Israelis and Congress have launched this massive campaign in order to thwart a U.S. return to the deal. And it does seem to be working well. So early Friday morning, Tehran time, Iran provided what it called its constructive reply to the latest American response in the ongoing nuclear negotiations. The American response has been very negative and may signal actually an end to the talks. So, as Dave writes here, in comments to Politico, an unnamed U.S. official slammed the Iranian response as, quote, not at all encouraging. We are studying Iran's response, but the bottom line is that it is not at all encouraging. A senior U.S. official said, based on the answer, we appear to be moving backwards. The U.S. official would not detail the contents of the text, but a European diplomat also shared this negative view. The diplomat told Politico that Iran's answer was negative and not reasonable. Now, Washington's harsh comments and negative reaction, particularly after this significant progress had been made, especially during these recent weeks, is most likely related to the extensive Israeli pressure as well as congressional opposition to the deal, in part led by Democrats like Josh Gothamer. Now, Gothamer recently led a bipartisan letter sent to Biden, signed by 34 Democrats and 16 Republicans in the House, peddling, FDD style, Foundation for Defense Democracy. They're the arguably most influential and notorious anti-Iran think tank in D.C. We've talked about Mark Dubowitz before, who runs the FDD, who's a big proponent of the sanctions wall and all these kinds of measures that were implemented during the Trump administration. But anyway, these Democrats, most of whom are, this is primarily a Democratic Party letter. They're saying that Iran's going to get $1 trillion out of this deal from Biden, return to and all this stuff, which is usually they're right now in terms of the PR, it's being pushed as Biden is giving Iran $1 trillion, whereas they actually mean in practice. And these estimates might not even be all that accurate, but it basically means that once their previously frozen assets are unfrozen and the sanctions are lifted, and Iran is able to start trading with international partners again and allowed to sell their oil freely on world markets, that they're going to make probably a lot of money. And so what they're doing is making it out that Biden is giving them this welfare of $1 trillion because we have the ability to just crush them indefinitely. And that's what obviously we should be doing. And in the meantime, they're saying that they're going to use all this money and all these gains from the oil sales to just throw it all into terrorism and attack America and attack Israel and all this stuff. So the other thing they're saying is that they're very concerned about Russia's role in the JCPOA. And again, there was this whole thing about after the war in Ukraine started, where Lavrov was concerned that Russia's obligations in the deal would be impeded by American sanctions and the American-led sanctions blitz, specifically regarding converting their uranium stockpile into nuclear fuel. But all that got worked out very quickly, and this was months and months ago. This is back in March, and so they're wheeling that out again, or just trying to tie it to all the Russia-phobia, and so they're urging the White House, of course, not to return to the deal. So as Middle East Eye reported, the letter says, strengthened with an estimated $1 trillion in sanctions relief over a decade, Iran and the IRGC would be an enormous danger to Americans at home and abroad and to our allies, said the letter, led by Democratic Congressman, again, Josh Gothamer. Therefore, we urge you not to return to any deal with Iran prior to releasing the full text of the agreement and any side agreements to Congress to provide us with an in-depth briefing on the matter and to consult with all key stakeholders, which I'm assuming means Israel. AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, which had also circulated a memo throughout Congress over the past several days, which included several of the same points in the letter, celebrated the effort and Gothamer's leading role. Several of the Democrats who signed the letter have received significant campaign contributions from AIPAC and its array of pro-Israel PACs. The most notable lawmaker to have signed the letter is Haley Stevens, who received $4 million from the AIPAC-linked super PAC, the United Democracy Project, and defeated incumbent Andy Levin in a highly contested primary race earlier this summer. The letter also comes days after a senior Israeli official said that the head of the Mossad spy agency the letter comes a day after a senior Israeli official said the head of the Mossad spy agency, that's David Barnea, would be traveling to Washington early this month, where he is set to take part in a series of closed-door meetings in Congress with the hopes of disrupting the nuclear deal talks. Israel is boosting its efforts to stop a return to the nuclear accord, as reports show the two sides are close to reaching a final deal, and we even had Macron saying recently that he hopes the deal would be signed in the coming few days. And that was at the very end of August. Now, the impasse is likely related to the guarantees surrounding sanctions relief and contingencies in the event that the U.S. unilaterally and illegally leaves the deal again, as well as this IAEA probe into the uranium particles discovered at the undeclared nuclear sites, which we've talked about several times. Now, here's the next one. Lapid says Israel's pressure on the U.S. against Iran nuclear deal is working. Okay, so the Israeli Prime Minister Yair Lapid is boasting that Tel Aviv's efforts to pressure Washington away from returning to the JCPOA is working without jeopardizing relations with the Americans. Lapid is using this apparent success to boost his capital ahead of the upcoming Israeli election in November, in which he will be contending with former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Now, quote, the reservations that we have presented to the American administration have been taken into account. We have also spoken with our partners. Demands have been made of the Iranians. In a shot at Netanyahu, he continued, for those who tell us that we are not shouting enough or not blunt enough, I will remind you what really happened in the past. In 2015, when Israel insisted on an unnecessary confrontation with the Obama administration, it was a complete failure. The pressure is continuing, of course, with David Barnea, who's been described really as the supreme Iran hawk in the Israeli security establishment, is going to be meeting with top officials this week again, including Jake Sullivan and top State Department and Pentagon officials. Now, Iran is anticipating Israeli attacks and have been taking defensive precautions. As Dave writes, Israel has a history of launching covert attacks inside Iran. With tensions high in the region, Tehran on Saturday boosted the readiness of its air defense systems and equipped many of its cities with civil defense systems. Last week, during a phone call between Biden and Lapid, the American president said the U.S. will not tie Israel's hands, deal or no deal, regarding an Israeli attack on Iran. Previous reporting about these comments came from a senior Israeli official, but it was confirmed by U.S. Ambassador to Israel Tom Nides at a press conference in Jerusalem earlier this month. As Axios reported, Nides spoke shortly after a meeting with Mossad Director David Barnea and a bipartisan congressional delegation, which I believe was the same delegation that Lindsey Graham led, that included Senator Bob Menendez. Barnea will travel tonight to Washington to meet with CI Director Bill Burns, and as I said, Sullivan and the other officials. Now, here we go. U.S. flies B-52 bombers over Middle East in a show of force aimed at Iran. This is from Dave DeCamp again at antiwar.com from September 5th. And it's important to remember always that, toward the end of the Trump administration, he was flying B-52s repeatedly over the Persian Gulf. It looked very much like we were about to head to war with Iran in the last months of Trump's administration. And I have a piece about that if people want to go review that, called Is Trump Starting a War with Iran? But, as soon as Biden came into office, notably, he flew B-52s over a B-52 over the Persian Gulf. And it was within the first week of him being in office. That really there were several steps that have been taken as soon as Biden came in that indicated that he was going to be essentially continuing Trump's policy of maximum pressure. And that has really proven to be the case, although I would argue that we're closer to war with Iran now than even maybe back then. We had, again, on Monday, on Labor Day, 2 American B-52s flew over the Middle East, according to a military statement. The bombers departed from the Royal Air Force Base in Fairford, England. The U.S. military makes no mention of Iran in its statement, though the U.S. frequently dispatches bombers to the region during nuclear negotiations or amid soaring tensions with Iran. Now, and as I said again, this was especially prominent during the Trump years. Now, the statement said that the bombers flew over the Mediterranean, the Arabian Peninsula, and the Red Sea. And they were joined by warplanes from Saudi Arabia and Kuwait before leaving the Middle East. According to the Israeli military, 3 Israeli F-16s escorted the bombers through Israeli airspace toward the Persian Gulf. Quote, the flight was held as part of close cooperation with the U.S. military, which represents a significant element in ensuring the security of the state of Israel's airspace and the Middle East, the Israeli Defense Forces said in a statement. Okay, so now we have Menendez speaking in Jerusalem regarding Biden and his commitment, apparently, to submit any possible deal with Iran now to, submit it for congressional review. So this is Senator Menendez says Biden committed to congressional review of Iran deal. Again, from Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com on the 5th. During a visit to Jerusalem with Lindsey Graham-led delegation, the hawkish Senator Bob Menendez from New Jersey, the Democrat, said Biden's administration committed to submitting any nuclear agreement with Iran to Congress for review. Now, notably, Menendez is one of the worst hawks in the entire government, in the entire legislative branch, and he's the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And so, as Dave writes here, quote, the administration has made this is Menendez. The administration has made the commitment that if they ever enter into an agreement to follow on from what was the JCPOA, they will submit it to Congress and we will review it. Menendez said at a press conference in Jerusalem, according to the Times of Israel. He said that the review would start with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which would be followed by a vote in the Senate. With virtually all Republicans and some Democrats opposed to reviving the deal, it's unlikely a vote endorsing an agreement with Iran would pass. But Menendez said he was, quote, unsure if the congressional review means that Congress would be able to block the agreement. Quote, whether that vote meets the threshold under the law to nullify that agreement is another question. Graham said that there would be strong bipartisan opposition in Congress to any efforts to reach an agreement with Iran. And I think that's the real danger here, is that the Democrats reveal themselves to be a bunch of Iran hawks. They've done next to nothing to push Biden to return to the deal here. And frankly, I mean, notably, I think the best senator so far, or even congressperson, has been Rand Paul in this issue. Who, he was previously bad on the deal, but he's actually positioned himself, even in some cases, to the left of Robert Malley, Biden's special envoy for Iran. Okay, now we have the EU foreign policy chief says Iran nuclear deal in danger. This is Joseph Borrell, and this is very alarming because he's the EU foreign policy chief who put forward the whole proposal that all these recent talks and progress have been based on. And he's alarmed at the dire prospects for a restoration of the deal after Washington's recent negative comments in regards to the latest Iranian response in the indirect talks. He said the positions are not closer. If the process does not converge, then the whole process is in danger. Now, since he put forward this final proposal at the end of July, his comments this Monday mark his most negative comments yet. So that's not a good sign. As Dave says, U.S. officials said that they conveyed to Iran not to link the IAEA investigation with the deal to revive the JCPOA. Iran reiterated its call for the IAEA to close its inquiry on Monday, but it's still not clear if that is a condition for Iran to sign an agreement with the U.S. Also on Monday, Iran rejected the U.S. characterization of its latest response in the negotiations as being negative. Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman Nasser Kanani described the Iranian response as constructive, transparent, and legal, and he said it can create the grounds for a conclusion of the talks. And we've talked about it quite a bit, but I'll just say with the undeclared sites issue, Raisi said after the reports came out in, I believe it was in Reuters, the U.S. official said that they had dropped that demand to have that inquiry closed. And of course, the Israelis insisted apparently that they don't want the Americans to get behind anything like that. And I don't think they were going to anyway. But the point is Raisi has said now and made clear, again, it could be a part of a side deal. It doesn't necessarily it wouldn't necessarily be a part of the actual agreement. Much like other issues that Iran has actually conceded on, like the IRGC delisting and things like this, or prisoner swaps, which I think are still very possible. But as far as the IAEA situation goes, Raisi said that the discussion of an agreement without closing that probe is meaningless. So unless he's purely doing this for domestic purposes, to not look too conciliatory in front of his supporters, which I can understand. I mean, in terms of with the assassination campaign, the increasing American sanctions under Biden, the fact that they've already had to make so many concessions in order to just get this close to a deal for it only to probably be just ripped up in their face, and then they'll be threatened with war. Raisi needs to do everything he can here to get the hardliners to at least not oppose him right now and make it a little easier so that they can actually do what needs to be done to potentially get back into the deal, such as it is. But I also can understand where they're coming from, because this issue, if it's not taken off the table, is just going to create more and more problems for Iran and justify potentially Biden even leaving the deal if they do hypothetically return to it before he even leaves office. And we're going to see more. The IEA is causing more problems and getting more and more political and undercutting the talks. But we'll get there in a second. Israel's Lapid delivers threat to Iran while standing next to an F-35. This is from Dave DeCamp again at antiwar.com on the 6th. So in a post that Lapid had on Twitter with a video, he's standing next to an F-35 and issues threats to Iran. And he warns that Iran will soon feel or could soon feel Israel's long arm. Lapid said it was too early to know if his pressure on the Biden administration to walk away from the Iran nuclear talks has worked, sort of walking back, I guess, his previous comments. Although I think it's pretty apparent that it is working. Now he says, quote, "It's still too early to know if we have indeed succeeded in stopping the nuclear agreement, but Israel is prepared for every threat in every scenario." He said this at the Nevatim Air Base in southern Israel. Quote, "If Iran continues to test us, it will discover Israel's long arm and capabilities. We will continue to act on all fronts against terrorism and against those who seek to arm us." I'm not sure at all what they're referencing when they say Iran continues to test us. I mean, Israel has repeatedly drone striked Iran this year alone in several important attacks, and of course carried out an unprecedented assassination campaign where they killed 6 people. Not to mention all the especially last year. And in 2020, the massive covert sabotage campaigns against their civilian nuclear energy program, which caused explosions and power outages and all kinds of, trouble for and the risks of just attacking a nuclear energy program like that are really off the charts, and all of that should be condemned. But of course, Washington gives them the green light to do whatever they want, and has been involved in attacks on places like the critical Natanz uranium enrichment facility. Now, so as well, he said that Lapid says in the video that he and Biden agreed again. He's talking about this, saying that Biden told him that America won't constrain Tel Aviv if it wants to attack Iran. Quote, "As President Biden and I agree, Israel has the full freedom to act as we see fit to prevent the possibility of Iran becoming a nuclear threat." Okay. Now, here we go with the IAEA. They're falsely hinting that Iran's nuclear program isn't peaceful. And this is from Jason Ditz from last night at antiwar.com. And so Jason says, continuing to undercut the ongoing nuclear talks, the IAEA issued a statement warning they can't assure Iran's nuclear program is entirely peaceful. And this is a recurring issue as the IAEA wants to keep the U.S. and others placated. The simplest way to do this is to claim the situation is unresolved. And that means deceptive fear-mongering. The media are dutifully spreading the narrative, of course, claiming Iran has almost enough uranium for a nuclear bomb, accompanied with the same caveats as usual about further processing, which isn't happening. The reality is that Iran's civilian program is exactly the same as it has been. The evidence is that the uranium stockpile grows steadily, with none being diverted to military purposes. As of August 21st, Iran's stockpile rests at about 3,621.3 kilograms, up 10% from the previous report in May. And the stockpile is not meant to be public, but these kind of leaks go out to the press, usually immediately. So Iran's enriched uranium is all far below weapons grade, of course, and they, as we always say, they've never attempted to enrich to weapons grade levels, which is a minimum of 90% purity. Iran's stockpile is mostly below 20%. All indications are that Iran is content with low-level enrichment and civilian purposes. 3.3% enrichment, for instance, is used to generate electricity. The IAEA comments are likely to worsen diplomacy at the talks, since the U.S. will say the IAEA doesn't trust them, and Iran has yet more evidence that there is no convincing the IAEA. And so again, along with the undeclared sites probe, this is again just the agency becoming more political and undermining the negotiations. And it's really irresponsible because the Iranians have a 52-year history of not diverting their uranium to military purposes and maintaining a strictly civilian nuclear energy program, despite massive provocations against them, especially by Washington and Tel Aviv. And of course, they've committed to never arming themselves with nuclear weapons or chemical weapons for that matter. And in the meantime, Israel has this illegal arsenal of somewhere like between 200 and 300 nuclear weapons, which make US aid to Tel Aviv illegal. So, the situation is just awful. So now we have now the U.S. This is a report from Zaman Yisrael, which is I understand is the Hebrew language sister site for Times of Israel. And the report, this is from Dave again from last night. Report: U.S. tells Israel the nuclear deal with Iran is off the table for now. So the website, the news site said that it learned that a new nuclear deal between the U.S. and Iran is off the table and will not be signed in the foreseeable future. The report didn't cite any sources, but it said that this message was conveyed to Israeli Prime Minister Yair Lapid during his recent conversations with Biden and other U.S. officials. All right. Now, there's really no we'll have to see here what comes next, if there is an American response to the Iranian response, and we can get some more details out of that, or more details into what Iran is demanding. But at the moment, it does appear like there is just no political will now to return to the deal. And so we could be heading for a very dangerous situation here with America and Israel and their allies surrounding Iran. And it is very disappointing to see that Kuwait took part in that mission, and Saudi Arabia, because they've been certainly Kuwait recently normalized relations with Iran, as we covered here recently with one of your articles, and then of course there was anticipation with all the great I shouldn't say great, but there's been important progress made diplomatically between Riyadh and Tehran from these talks that have been brokered by the Iraqis. But you know what? The Saudis have done things like this in the midst of those kinds of talks going back and forth. Anyway, so maybe that won't cause too many problems. It's still not a positive development. So now here we have a piece I wrote with Will Porter called "The Saudis Used Orwellian App to Identify Dissidents, Imprisoning Some 4 Decades." So this is pretty this is pretty shocking. So we have Saudi Arabians are using a mobile app, so by both Apple and Google, to snitch on their fellow citizens for dissenting against government authorities. As a result, activists and others are going to prison for more than 30 years in some cases, Business Insider reported on Friday. Now, on August 16th, a Saudi national named Salma El-Shabab, a PhD student at Leeds University, was sentenced to 34 years in prison for tweets, quote, in support of activists and members of the kingdom's political opposition in exile, the report said. Though the posts were made while she was in the UK, El-Shabab was nonetheless reported through the Kelowna app, and she was immediately arrested upon returning home. There's a quote in there from a Saudi women's rights activist who uses an alias her name is Real. And she told the Business Insider, "Every day we wake up to hear news that somebody has been arrested or somebody has been taken." Kelowna Amn, which roughly translates to "We are all security" in Arabic, was launched by the Saudi Interior Ministry in 2017. But in the last few years, there's been a dramatic surge in court cases referencing the app, according to legal rights activists. The app quote, encourages everyday citizens to play the role of police and become active participants in their own repression. Putting the state's eyes everywhere also creates a pervasive sense of uncertainty. There is always a potential informant in the room or following your social media accounts, said Nora Al-Jazawi, a researcher at Citizen Lab, which focuses on threats to free speech online. All right, now the Orwellian nature of the app is such that users actually report on people defensively, fearing they could face punishment themselves for merely overhearing speech deemed offensive to the regime. So one of the examples that they give is like if you're let's say, I don't know, you're at a restaurant or something and you overhear somebody saying something and there's other people there as well, that and what is being said could potentially be something that, in other words, if somebody thinks that what you're saying is controversial, they will report it. But if you're also in the room and not involved, you could also be implicated just because you happen to be there. So people in effect race each other to report on the other people in your proximity as first, so that you at least don't get taken off to jail or prison. It's absolutely like something out of 1984. So despite its role in crushing dissent in the repressive Gulf monarchy, Also they're using people use this as like for blackmail and as they say to settle scores. Despite its role in crushing dissent in the repressive Gulf monarchy, the app is still sold by both Apple and Google, neither of which responded to the insider's request for comment. Google, moreover, is set to open 2 new offices in Saudi Arabia sometime this year, and they're working on a controversial data project, a data partnership with Saudi Aramco, the state-run oil firm. Now, the tech giant insists it will safeguard user data, but some activists say the move will risk lives and hand the government additional tools to spy on citizens. In some cases, privacy concerns have led activists to keep 2 or 3 phones, one that contains government apps and the others that don't, in an attempt to just avoid this totalitarian surveillance that is facilitated by American companies. In May last year, a doctor named Lena Al-Sharif was jailed on unknown charges, though people close to her said someone attempted to blackmail her and threatened to report her through the Kelowna Amn app. And she had been advocating for human rights in Saudi Arabia on Twitter prior to her arrest. There are about I believe there are 2.4 million, almost 2.5 million Saudis on Twitter. But of course, the site and other social media platforms have been used by Riyadh to crack down on political dissent and activism, as well as, of course, to police the regime's austere moral code. Now, another case in 2019 resulted in a 3-year prison sentence for a man named Suhail Youssef Al-Yahya, who's a gay man who was charged with cybercrimes and public decency offenses after he merely posted pictures of himself in a bathing suit. Now, not only has the Saudi state used mobile apps and social media against its critics, employees at some platforms have actively worked to carry out the Saudi agenda. In August, an ex-manager at Twitter was found guilty in an American federal court of working on Riyadh's behalf without registering himself as a foreign agent. He allegedly received hundreds of thousands of dollars in exchange for information about Saudi dissidents, including their email addresses, phone numbers, and other data. All right. Now, the next piece I have here, I wrote for antiwar.com. Last Friday, this is the State Department has now approved the $1.1 billion weapons package for Taiwan. And separately, I report here on a piece in the Wall Street Journal about how the Pentagon has set up a task force to speed up arms sales to countries around the globe. Now, this sale had previously been reported, I believe, in Politico, that they were planning on making this massive. This would be Biden's largest arms sale approved for Taiwan during his administration so far. Now, the announcement angered Beijing, of course, which warned of countermeasures if the plans are not revoked. But of course, among American lawmakers, we have ample bipartisan support for arming the island, and the required congressional approval is virtually guaranteed. And of course, the Pentagon is working to increase the speed at which the U.S. can sell weapons globally, as roadblocks in the system are slowing things down, leading potential customers to buy less expensive Russian and Chinese advanced equipment. It's also being framed as a way to compete. It's not we're not just trying to sell a bunch of weapons all over the world. It's because we have to compete with Russia and China. So the arms package for Taipei includes $355 million for 60 Harpoon anti-ship missiles, $85 million for 100 Sidewinder air-to-air missiles, and $655 million logistics support package to maintain and upgrade the island's Raytheon-made early warning radar system. A State Department spokesman said the U.S. still recognizes only Beijing, which along with most of the world, including Washington, sees Taiwan as Chinese territory. Since 1979, this has been the official American policy. However, in recent years, arms sales to the island have significantly increased, and the U.S. has been sending a parade of delegations comprised of various lawmakers and high-level officials, eroding this diplomatic arrangement, which has long kept the peace. There was another delegation this week. There's a story about it on antiwar.com today. It was led by a Democratic congresswoman out of Florida named, I believe, Stephanie Murphy. And that's the 6th delegation of U.S. officials since Pelosi's visit, which triggered the largest military exercises around the island, ever. And of course, all this is doing is ramping up tensions and making war more likely. Now, let's see. So Li Penghu, Spokesman for the Chinese embassy in Washington said the potential sale sends wrong signals to Taiwan independent separatist forces and severely jeopardizes China-U.S. relations and peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. The Taiwan issue is a red line for China. Beijing has repeatedly expressed concerns that Washington's emboldening of the island's independence forces, as well as hostile U.S. military maneuvers near the island, destabilizes cross-strait relations and risks war between China and the United States. Liu said China will resolutely take legitimate and necessary countermeasures in light of the development of the situation. And of course, last weekend, 2 American warships crossed the Taiwan Strait, which China considers its sovereign waters. And of course, this is an almost monthly occurrence. Now, the Wall Street Journal report, which cites U.S. officials, says the Pentagon has formed a task force to expedite the process of supplying weapons to global partners to compete with China and Russia. Last month, the Tiger team, comprised of senior officials, was set up to examine what the Pentagon sees as inefficiencies and roadblocks in the foreign military sales program, which is overseen by the State Department. The State Department is adding their input to the Pentagon's assessment. But among other things, concerns about transferring sensitive technology slows the process, leading foreign governments to look elsewhere for cheaper advanced equipment because of delays or because it's just not they can't get the approval. So officials worry this gives Moscow and Beijing a competitive advantage. Some of the brilliant ideas they have for getting over these roadblocks are explained here in the report. A defense official told the Journal, U.S. officials who work with countries on initial requests for new drones, for example, could be trained to help those countries draft those letters better, removing roadblocks that pop up because the initial request was too broad or triggered other security concerns. The review's urgency is said to have been enhanced by rising tensions with China and the war in Ukraine. The report says some in the arms industry, the government, and Congress are alarmed at the convergence of challenges for the defense industry and U.S. military readiness. Of course, recent reporting in the Wall Street Journal, in fact, indicated that Washington's massive funding of its proxy war against Russia and Ukraine has led American artillery stockpiles to become, quote, uncomfortably low. There is also a large backlog of European allies in line to have their own stocks replenished by the American military-industrial complex after transferring hundreds of millions of dollars worth of their own weapons to Kiev. Now, earlier this year, this is all nonsense because earlier this year, just in terms of this whole, well, we've got to compete with Russia and China. Because earlier this year, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute published a study which showed the U.S. was still by far the world's largest arms exporter. As Forbes reported, from 2017 to 2021, the U.S. accounted for 39% of major arms deliveries worldwide, over twice what Russia transferred and nearly 10 times what China sent to its weapons clients. In addition, the U.S. has far more customers. 103 nations, or more than half the member states of the United Nations. So it's just, they are just absolutely escalating this new front. The Cold War with China here. There's a statistic that Dave included in one of his articles this week, again about this new delegation. The median line, the informal barrier between that divides the strait between Taiwan and the mainland, between the 50s and August of 2020, Beijing operated over that line with planes only 4 times. And then after the U.S. started selling all these high-level officials and these other delegations to the island, just eroding the policy, the One China policy. And of course, now we have to keep an eye on the Taiwan Policy Act of 2022, which Menendez put forward with Graham. And that is upending the policy entirely. Turning Taiwan into a major non-NATO ally, and it's got billions of dollars in military aid in there, and would elevate their position in all kinds of international institutions. And the whole thing is an absolute. We're moving closer and closer to what a lot of the hawks want, which is what they call strategic clarity. In fact, there's even Chris Murphy, the Democrat. The Democratic Center was very alarmed about that bill because it basically makes it sound like what we're doing is we're planning military strategies for how to defend the island, which is something that, the Navy Secretary, Carlos Del Toro, when he was in his confirmation hearings, Josh Hawley, who is a China hawk, despite this populist sort of veneer, he says, he asked him, do you think it's absolutely necessary that the United States Navy be able to defend Taiwan? And Del Toro said, absolutely. And just like the new Air Force Secretary walked right off of Raytheon, that Biden has appointed, all these guys, their main focus is always China, 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 China. And this is Obama's Asia pivot, moving 2/3 of all air and naval forces to surround China, the biggest military buildup, hundreds of bases, biggest military buildup since World War II. And so, of course, with this median line thing, after August 2020 and before Pelosi's visit, I think they only did that something like 23 times. And now, since Pelosi's visit, the Chinese have flown over 300, just over 300 sorties over that line. And of course, there's more talk, is a part of this story about the arms sale. One of the things that's in there, the Pentagon wants, or excuse me, these hawks like Menendez and Graham want to give Taiwan a lot more military aid, and one of their points is that you have to, increase your spending. We're going to sell this many more. We're going to give you all this military aid. We want you to start spending more on your defense. And of course, Taiwan has recently announced they're going to be increasing their defense budget by, I believe, 14%. And of course, there have been these recent incidents where Taiwan has shot down civilian drones on the Quemoy, above the Quemoy Islands, which are just right off of the coast of southeastern China. And one of the things that they're looking to spend more money on are sort of anti-drone systems. And so, of course, all of this is just getting ramped up. And it's really, China has no reason, especially with its robust trade relationship and the fact that these people are, the people of the mainland and the people of Taiwan. There's constantly people traveling back and forth and visiting their families, and these people are kin. There's, as China reiterated recently in a white paper, they do not want to reunify with the island violently. But they do not rule that out because of the American military posture in the region and this increasing support for, as I said, Taiwan's independence forces. And, if they do, our policies just make this conflict much more inevitable. It's very possible that, the U.S. could be planning something similar to what they have. Logistically, I'm sure it would be much more complicated, but I wouldn't put it past them for being this hawkish and this reckless. But they could be planning some kind of a proxy war where they arm Taiwan. Because we have troops under Biden, we have troops openly deployed to the island, training Taiwanese forces for eventual war with the mainland. And this is all a complete violation of the Taiwan Relations Act and the agreements that were made, through the Nixon years and into Carter's administration, which have kept the peace for almost 50 years. And now, really, the Democrats have led this whole thing, but it's such a bipartisan project. And it is the main project of the American empire right now, is taking on China.
All right, Connor, thank you for that report. We'll be back with more shows next week, everyone. And just be sure to follow the show at Con_interest. I'm at Kyle Anzalone_. Connor is at Freeman Minds 96. Thanks, Connor.
Thanks, Kyle. Thanks, everybody.